unfortunately traveling right now, so he sent his introduction. So I'm speaking on behalf of Professor Kuo, who's the Cinema and Media Studies, Chinese Art History, and Archaeology professor at the University of Maryland, in order to introduce his graduate student, Filippo Grassi. So I'm now reading what he wrote to me. So this is his introduction. Filippo Grassi is a second-year PhD student studying contemporary Chinese art under the mentorship of Jason Kuo. He hails from the hills and factories of Brianza, a region with vague geographical borders but strong sense of belonging near Milan, Italy. Filippo holds both a bachelor's and a master's degree in Chinese language and culture from Ca' Foscari University of Venice. His academic journey led him to enriching experiences through exchange programs in the United States. He spent 5 months at Georgia State University and Taiwan, 1 year at Fujian Catholic University. His research focuses on cultural identity and the modern reinterpretation of tradition within the realm of contemporary Chinese art. In the 3 years following his graduation, he worked as a web developer for an art gallery in Milan, an opportunity that allowed him to strengthen his programming skills and nurture his keen interest in digital humanities. The title of today's paper is Hsiao, Being Modern, Being Chinese, Being Nomadic, and I welcome up Filippo.
Thank you very much, Alison, for this introduction. Thank you to the Barnes Foundation for organizing this wonderful symposium. And I'm gonna start. The life of the painter Hsiao is a tale of continuous migration. He was born in China, moved to Taiwan in 1949, and then to Spain, Italy, the USA, Italy again, and finally Taiwan, where he continued to work until his death in 2023. My paper aims to readdress one of the most understudied periods of Hsiao's career, namely the years he spent for the largest part working in New York City between 1967 and 1971. Hsiao production in these years has been labeled as hard edge for its emphasis on precise geometric shapes and areas of unvarying color. In my research, I underlined the complexity of factors that engendered Hsiao's concern to be both modern and Chinese. In America, we can see how the artist developed a language that revealed both the difficulty of navigating a post-colonial world as well as original pictorial statements of artistic autonomy. David Clark, in his brilliant analysis of post-war Chinese abstraction, suggests that due to a cultural aversion to extremities of any kind, it is not possible to identify a Chinese artistic response to minimalism. Hsiao's American works prompt us to interrogate and recomplicate this analysis. After being initiated into modernist art in Taiwan, Hsiao began his diasporic career by moving to Europe in 1956. While time constraints do not allow me to examine Hsiao's training in Taiwan and his first years in Europe, it was then that Hsiao first grappled with the preoccupation of being both a modern and a Chinese artist. In Taiwan, this preoccupation was rooted in the early 20th century discourses over national identity, product of mainland China's colonial modernity, while also responding to the contemporary ultra-conservative cultural policies of the Nationalist Party. These concerns deepened with the experience of displacement in the West, where, as a conspicuously foreign artist, Hsiao was both acutely aware and constantly reminded of his otherness. After around 10 years in Europe, Hsiao's decision to move to New York in 1967 was motivated by his desire to look for more career opportunities. As he writes in a letter to the gallerist that briefly represented him in the city, quote, "I am planning to go to New York because I think it is now the center of art in the world," end quote. In another letter, Hsiao mentions that after his first brief stay in New York in 1966, quote, "My painting changed a little bit, more intense and absolute, I hope," end quote. This new type of painting, however, has attracted less scholarly attention than other periods of the artist's career. The two most important reasons for this are that in America, Hsiao's production was evidently in dialogue with hard-edge painting and minimalism, and that geometric abstraction is usually considered alien in the context of Chinese abstraction. As Hsiao Qiangrui puts it, quote, "The geometric forms seem to be distanced from Hsiao's original culture, which emphasizes spirituality and dynamic movement," end quote. In order to distance Hsiao's paintings from contemporary American production, some critics underline how Hsiao's work represented a complex symbolic operation, were based primarily on intuitiveness rather than rationality, and preserved their original emotional and spiritual inclination. The artist himself explains that, quote, "There were still fundamental differences from the purely rational minimalism of the West. Anglo-Saxon rationality only influenced my expressive techniques. It could not change my intuitive Eastern nature," end quote. By drawing attention to ideas of intuitiveness or symbolism as typical Eastern elements, these perspectives want to highlight that Hsiao's work still remained fundamentally Chinese. In this paper, these ideas are explored first and foremost as discursive tropes adopted by the painter to resist the reading of his work as overly Western. I aim, on the other hand, to highlight Hsiao's deep and conscious engagement with contemporary American trends. By acknowledging the tension between Hsiao's visual dialogues with these trends and his intentions, I propose to concentrate on those elements of difference that, while sometimes still embedded in colonially coded tropes of Easternness, challenged Western artistic production first and foremost in pictorial terms. In Hsiao's American works, I argue that the most important feature and the most fundamental element of resistance against American hard edge is a reflection on space and on the very nature of the object of art. Hsiao's American works appear to challenge the theoretical foundations on which post-painterly abstraction carefully built its endeavors, namely Clement Greenberg's ideas on flatness in painting. According to Greenberg, modernist painting was a gradual movement towards flatness, aimed at the construction of a surface solely focused on the formalist qualities of painterly elements. This emphasis on flatness was echoed in Frank Stella's well-known quote that what you see is what you see. Hsiao engaged in conversation with these theories and adopted some aspects of the pictorial language through which they were visualized in order to propose something radically incompatible with them. Before delving into Hsiao's artworks, one other factor that should be emphasized is the material conditions in which the painter worked. As Hsiao admits in an interview, he decided in 1971 to go back to Europe because in America he could not sell any of his artworks. Hsiao's financial difficulties are echoed in a letter to Henry Gallery in February 1968. Hsiao asks, quote, "I sent you some slides of my recent work, hoping I could have the chance to show in your gallery. In case you're interested, please let me know. If not, would you be so kind to send me back the slides?" End quote. For Hsiao, adopting signifiers of contemporaneity, understandable to an American audience, did not only respond to ideals of cosmopolitanism, but also to the need to make a breakthrough through a legible language in a competitive market. Hsiao's early works in America are undoubtedly minimal. Large monochrome backgrounds and shapes, thin and straight lines, and small circles are the three main compositional elements, arranged on shaped canvases. Hsiao's palette in these works is usually limited to 3 or 4 colors, but the selection of hues is meticulous. In the 1967 work Sublimation, vivid green and red are chosen as complementary colors on a subdued beige background. Symmetry and an opposition between contrasting elements are identified by some commentators as Hsiao's statement of cultural identity, interpreted to point to the same Taoist principle of balance within duality explored in Hsiao's previous artworks. Besides these visual elements, some of the titles of these works also signal a symbolic dimension that the artist wants to call attention to. In 1961, Hsiao had founded in Milan the Punto International Movement. Xiaoqin was unhappy with what he saw as the instinctive nature of American abstract expressionism. He believed art should instead possess a spiritual dimension and serve as a space for reflection, concepts that Hsiao explained as rooted in his reading of the fundamental texts of Taoist thought in that period. In early American works, like Sublimation or The Ego in the Infinity, the titles seem to suggest that the painterly flatness that we see is not, in fact, what we see, but is the product of the artist's deep self-introspection and is aimed at opening a boundless space of meditation. Despite all these interesting elements of resistance to Westernization, Greenberg's imperative to pictorial flatness seems to be respected in Hsiao's first American works. His ideas regarding the intuitive Eastern nature or spirituality of his paintings appear to be constructed mainly as discursive tropes, but they are, in fact, particularly revealing when looking at Hsiao's work. If, on the one hand, spirituality is embraced by the artist to describe his work's distinctiveness from Western abstraction, and substantiated with a profound study of Chinese philosophical tradition, the idea of a spiritual East is to this day characteristic of a Western essentializing gaze and loaded with colonial implications. In America, did Hsiao own it? Did he play with it strategically? Did he give in to it as a cultural assumption placed on him as a Chinese artist? I believe that there is no response, because most likely all three are true. With later paintings, however, these ideas became more visibly articulated primarily through a descent to flatness. In later works, stripes or bands of multiple colors either cross the surface in a straight line or at some point turn and form an angle. Alongside these stripes, the canvases are also usually filled with wide monochromatic areas of carefully chosen colors, aimed at accentuating the compositional tension. As noted by Jiang Guoxin, however, these works should not be read as flat and two-dimensional, but rather in their sculptural nature. If we look at Hsiao's 1968 Untitled, on the left, for example, the colored stripes extend to the edges of the canvas, giving the sides a fundamental expressive role. In the catalog dedicated to the artist, published in 1970 by Hsiao's Italian gallery, his work New Course 8 is reproduced at a three-quarter angle to emphasize that its flatness is only apparent, and the spatial and invasive dimension of the canvas is an integral part of the work itself. The same feature of these works is highlighted in the photographs included in the 1969 article dedicated to the artist in the Hong Kong magazine Cosmorama. The photographs depict Hsiao and his works against the unusual urban backdrop of New York City. The paintings are pictured as unapologetically three-dimensional. The environment in which they're placed, so manifestly contrasting with them, also appears to accentuate the role of these works as interruptions, alternative spaces from the urban setting around them. Xiaoqin claims that, quote, "In this time of overly developed material civilization, it is the people of the West who are coming to the East in a quest for wisdom," end quote. The pictures in Cosmorama appear to recur to the same spiritual versus material contraposition to underline Xiaoqin's otherness as a Chinese artist in the American industrial context. The Chinese commentary on the photographs indicates that, quote, "Xiaoqin's works evoke a feeling of ethereal vastness and express from within a Chinese spirit," end quote. While apparently flat, the three-dimensionality of the works is aimed at spatially challenging the context in which they're placed and capturing the viewer. If the stripes in these paintings might nod to the works of the color-filled painter Kenneth Noland of the same period, They also more strongly evoke the signature zips of the abstract expressionist Barnett Newman, compositional elements that are at once simple yet complex, disruptive yet unifying, flat yet imbued with transcendental meanings. This formal resemblance prompts a reflection. Noland and Newman used a similar element of the stripe while communicating profoundly different conceptions of painting. Similarly, in looking at Hsiao's work, it is important to set aside outdated questions of influence on non-Western artists and take into serious consideration what the painter really does with shared tools. Hsiao uses tools similar to those of hard edge while fundamentally opposing its main tenets, and by enhancing the sculptural nature of his paintings, he wants to propose objects of art that are aimed at conveying metaphysical meanings beyond their flat surface. Interesting spatial suggestions also come from Hsiao's works in steel and copper. Color and material recall the well-known Untitled by Donald Judd. But once again, it is not the objecthood of the artwork in the space what Hsiao appears to be underlining. On the very first page of the aforementioned catalogue, we see a photograph of the artist looking at his distorted image reflected in one of his works. This picture testifies to the fundamentally interactive nature of this work, of its role not only as a three-dimensional object with a volume, but as a piece that is able to bend and warp and merge with the space in which it is located. In Reflection 3 in the same catalogue, the title of the artwork is also particularly telling, in which we see it on the right. The title plays with the double meaning of the return of light from a mirror and the product of thinking. The viewer is invited to reflect themselves in the mirroring surface of the metal, and by doing so, to be taken aback, to enter once again a realm of reflection that transcends the space of the gallery. In Arrow and other contemporary artworks, the surface, instead of being reflective, is painted, but it is crossed by a deep cut. In this case, it is the cut that points to yet another attempt from Hsiao to resist exactness. By intervening in the spatial and sculptural dimension of the artworks, Hsiao introduces compositional elements of rapture and surprise to evade an interpretation of his work as overly geometric and rationalizing, and therefore overly Western. The work of Hsiao Qin in America was simultaneously informed by motions of resistance aimed at expressing a fundamental diversity between his work and that of his Western counterparts, and moved by the will to connect with what were perceived as the Western centers of modern art. The shifting tension was explored by Hsiao, not without difficulties, through both discursive tropes and visual strategies. Hsiao's American period complicates notions that see geometric abstraction as too much of a deracination for a Chinese painter. It also prompts viewers and commentators to contemplate how the very necessity of self-fashioning for Hsiao Qin in his nomadic career was informed by a complex mix of political, historical, art historical, personal, and even financial factors. One thing, however, is certain. If you sit with these artworks, you will realize that what you first see is much more than what you see. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jessica Horton. I am an associate professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Delaware. And I'm very sorry I can't be with you all today for the symposium due to my teaching commitments, but I am delighted to introduce Julia Hamerlight. Julia is writing a dissertation centered on the woven assemblages and radical artistic pedagogy of Lakota artist and elder Arthur Amiotte under my advising. Julia earned a BA in American Studies at Yale University in 2018 and her MA in Art History at the University of Delaware in 2021. and she has just departed a pre-doctoral fellowship in American craft at the Smithsonian American Art Museum to become the Barra Fellow at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where she will play a key role in the next wave of rethinking the American galleries. Julia's dissertation places Amiotte's work as an artist, educator, and curator at the center of a broader movement to overturn decades of colonial pedagogy and reassert Indigenous relational values and forms of knowledge transmission in the 1960s and 70s. Now, the American Indian movement is often prioritized as the site of revolutionary change during this era, but Julia shows us that art education was undergoing an analogous transformation. While rooted in Lakota land and culture, Amiotte was also on the move, seemingly present at the most critical sites where Indigenous modernisms were studied, taught, and innovated. And Julia shows us how his place-based art and pedagogy generated new forms of more than human collectivity within the polyphonic history of global modernisms. She also demonstrates how art education can further urgent projects of Native cultural self-determination, political sovereignty, and environmental justice. This work is informed by her close relationship with the artist through visiting, archiving, and letter writing. Julia has folded these relational modalities into her writing in beautiful ways. She writes, I quote, "Acts of reciprocity usually live outside the defined structure of academic research, but I wonder if they could become an expected part of what art historical research means," unquote. And I also want to add that the relational and community-based methods from her dissertation are critical to Julia's expansive vision of what it means to become a curator of American art. She's the kind of person who transforms institutions rather than merely accepting a designated place within them. Thank you.
I guess I'll have to ask Jessica, or say thank you to Jessica later. Thank you all so much for sticking around for the end of this wonderful symposium here at the Barnes Foundation. And thank you also to Aaliyah and everyone else who has made our day and a half here so wonderful. Oh, sorry. Oh, I jumped the gun. Okay. As Jessica shared, today I will share a paper that comes out of my dissertation on Oglala Lakota artist, teacher, and culture bearer Arthur Amiotte's fiber wall hangings, art pedagogy, and exhibition practices during the 1960s and 1970s. Much of this research took place in the Oceti-Sakowin territory in what is now known as South Dakota, but I wrote this paper here in Lenapehoking, colonially known as Philadelphia. At the center of my project is hours of conversation and collaborative research with Amiotte himself. This work would not exist without his generosity. The exhibition Experiments in Collaboration opened at the Sioux Indian Museum in Rapid City, South Dakota in the spring of 1973. Oglala Lakota artist Arthur Amiotte organized the show with his grandmother, Christina Standing Bear Mesteth, and two aunts, Rose Gibbons and Lula Two Bonnets. This installation shot shows the work of all four artists. Amiotte's fiber composition, Door to the World, hangs to the left of the case, containing a shawl, pipe bags, and cradle boards attributed to Two Bonnets, Gibbons, and Mesteth, while beaded moccasins and leggings by the women sit on minimalist plinths below. The reflection of the wall hanging shows in the glass of the case, as though to illustrate the reciprocal cycle of influence between Amiotte's wall hangings and his relatives' creative work. As mentioned, I have been fortunate to be able to frame this project in dialogue with the artist, who has hosted me in his studio and library during repeated visits for hours of conversation and sifting through his personal archives. Within the context of our present research, I have continually returned to Experiments in Collaboration as a model for methodology. In the exhibition, Amiotte built on the ethic of generosity embodied in the giveaway his family had held a year earlier in 1972 in conjunction with another exhibition. In this paper, I position the wall hangings that Amiotte made with his relatives for experiments in collaboration, as well as the beadwork that the three women contributed, as lively belongings with the agency to carry story into and out of museum galleries. Amiotte was born in 1942 in Manderson in Wajiahanhanoyanke, or the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. On both his father's and his mother's sides, he descended from generations of Lakota leaders and artists. He left home in 1960 to earn a bachelor's degree in art education and went on to complete coursework for a master's degree in the same subject. In 1969, at the age of 27, he returned to Pine Ridge to teach art in the primarily Lakota Bureau of Affairs, or BIA, Porcupine Day School. In 1972, Amiotte stopped teaching and moved back to Manderson to start a curriculum development lab for the BIA. That year, the entire family was preparing for a giveaway for the Hunka ceremony of Amiotte's young son. In a giveaway, a family distributes gifts to their community in the name of the person they want to honor. In the process, 3 different parties, the person honored, the giver, and the recipients, are brought into closer relationship. Amiotte and his relatives pieced quilt tops, beaded moccasin vamps, and bought woolen Pendleton blankets for the event, some of which you can see displayed in the photograph on the left. To honor select guests, like the women in the photograph on the right, they sewed dresses out of woolen trade cloth, decorated with elk teeth or accompanied by dentalium shell capes. To Amiotte, the giveaway, where a family spends months, if not years, making and gathering beautiful and useful things, is the root of Lakota aesthetic practices. Speaking in an interview in 1990, Amiotte described the event, quote, "The idea was that you ennobled the object itself and others within the group by giving them these fine things. The admonition is that if you think you own these goods, even though they belong to someone else, you must cut yourself off from them and think in another way," unquote. In other words, people made beautiful things in order to give them away. Amiotte's preparations for the giveaway and collaboration with his family melded with his work as an artist. He had already exhibited both his paintings and fiber wall hangings in group and solo shows in South Dakota and nationally. In early 1972, the director of the South Dakota Memorial Art Center in Brookings reached out about developing another exhibition. Amiotte was too busy to add this additional project, but he figured that he could show wall hangings that he had already completed alongside some of the work he and his relatives had made for the giveaway already instead. In this installation view, a star quilt top is spread over an exhibition plinth like a bed. One of Amiotte's wall hangings, let's see if I can get this to work, Late Spring 2 hangs to the far left, while an early version of Door to the World, which he would later rework, hangs at center. The quilt draped over the mannequin's shoulders to the right would later be given to a guest at the giveaway. Brief glimpses of the giveaway from 1972 persist in a silent reel of Super 8 film recorded by a guest. One woman helps another slip a dress from the exhibition over her head, its yoke decorated with elk's teeth, covering the short mod dress and tall white boots she had put on that morning. A young Amiotte in another frame, hair braided and wearing a red shirt, leads his small son by the hand, followed by a procession of others. This panning shot that briefly shows blanket after blanket decorated with ribbon and carefully hung on clothing lines between canvas teepees would be easy to miss between the film's rapid cuts. But in scenes from the giveaway and later ones that Amiotte hosted, I have kept coming back to the invitation posed by this backdrop to other events of the day. The line of blanket replicates how, during the reservation era and before, relatives would hang an ozan or dew curtain outside of the teepee to tell passersby that they would be hosting a giveaway. The ozan was one of the most important parts of the interior decoration scheme of the teepee, sometimes adorned with porcupine quill or bead fancywork, and other times painted with narrative scenes. The word teepee itself means literally, quote, "they dwell" or "they dwell in." Where the translation of home is passive in English, the term in Lakota expresses an action. By extending the ozan, seen here behind the gifts at this giveaway, from 1919, into public space, the family extended the active sense of dwelling or making a home into the space outside the teepee. In 1972, the blankets played the same role. In Amiotte's words, quote, "It's like an extension of the interior of your teepee. This is our environment, welcome to our home, and this is what we're doing," unquote. The display itself was an integral part of bringing people into the circle of generosity and gratitude engendered by the giveaway. The lessons of holding the exhibition and giveaway congruently stayed with Amiotte. He wanted viewers and museums to see the work he and his relatives made both as part of a long continuum of Lakota creative expression and as concrete aesthetic statements, separate from the connotation of use value. Organizing experiments in collaboration the next year, in 1973, gave him an opportunity to develop a curatorial approach guided by that commitment. A 23-foot-long wall hanging entitled Whirlwind Design greeted visitors with vibrant red and black piecework that came from Lakota quilting designs and echoed the draped blankets of the giveaway. The wall hangings, beadwork, and paintings on display at the Sioux Indian Museum brought Lakota principles of abstraction into the gallery space, while also responding to broader contemporary explorations in fiber and modernist painting. Amiotte described the exhibition as, quote, "a personal and perhaps idiosyncratic redefinition of Indian art," unquote. But the redefinition brought about by Amiotte, his grandmother, and aunts did not just rely on the visual language of the work. It lay also in the artistic and curatorial practice. In the catalog essay for the exhibition, Amiotte describes the collaboration, quote, "The creative process thus becomes a shared activity in day-to-day living, as well as a unifying and concentrating of talents directed towards a composite whole. Such a process is not new to our people, as this way has almost always been the pattern of much creative activity, ranging in variety from acquiring the animals, birds, and vegetal materials from which hides, sinew, bone, horn, and feathers are obtained, to the actual designing and manufacturing of the finished items," unquote. Here, Amiotte's aunt, Rose Gibbons, is deep in concentration while sewing a dress for experiments in collaboration. During their preparations, Amiotte remembers sitting across the table from her in a similar manner while working on beaded elk hide robe. As they sat carefully sewing beads onto the same piece of hide, they practiced art as their ancestors had for generations. Sitting and sewing, piecing fabric together, and beading together, they all contributed to bringing the exhibition into being. Amiotte collaborated with both of his aunts on larger compositions like Transition Robe. At center, an uneven red ellipse rises like a sun in a dark blue sky, framed by bands of black, red, and yellow, reminiscent of a historic Lakota robe. Amiotte sketched the design and wove the beaded strips, while Rose Gibbons pieced and sewed the fabric and Lula Two Bonnets beaded the medallions. Christina Standing Bear Mesteth, his grandmother and their mother, an accomplished beadwork artist who had, in turn, taught each of the others how to bead, likely sat nearby looking at her own work. The checklist for experiments in collaboration shows 52 objects, ranging from moccasins to pipe bags to paintings to wall hangings. Soft graphite pencil next to each entry lists either a price or NFS, not for sale. None of the wall hangings have titles, but one whose dimensions match those of Transition Robe is listed for $400, while another entry matching beaded elk hide robe is listed for $700. When I asked Amiotte about the relationship between the giveaway and the exhibition, he replied that the format of an exhibition is, quote, "a very white thing," unquote, very different from the giveaway. Where the giveaway facilitates the lives that belongings take on through circulation, works displayed in exhibitions are usually destined for collections. But those belongings marked NFS here instead returned home to be used in ceremony or given as gifts. The money the four of them made from the sale of the work during the exhibition allowed the household to continue to practice generosity and support their community. Experiments in collaboration came at a moment when the federally owned and operated Sioux Indian Museum was finally reconsidering its historic practices of ethnographic collection and display. The museum opened in 1935 as the Pioneer Museum of the West River Historical Society in Rapid City, with an exhibit of Swedish settler John A. Anderson's collection of Lakota and Dakota art. Newspaper articles about the opening of the museum describe Anderson's collection as full of, quote, Indian curios, unquote, and artifacts, placing the objects and their makers in a disappearing primitive past. The collections arrested the movement of cultural belongings that Anderson had acquired during his decades managing a trading post, halting the cycles of generosity and exchange that imbued these belongings with life and vibrancy within their communities of origin. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, however, the Sioux Indian Museum increasingly supported the work of contemporary Native artists like Amiotte and demonstrated a desire to move beyond an ethnographic lens. And the work projects like Experiments in Collaboration allowed a select few Lakota artists and the work they made to begin visiting once more with the belongings Anderson had collected. In wall hangings like this one, Transitional Composition, you can see how Amiotte and his relatives grandmothered media like beads and wool into a Lakota understanding of animacy. Grandmothering is a term I borrow from Métis scholar and beadwork artist Sherry Farrell Rissette. Before traders brought these materials to the plains, Amiotte's ancestors worked exclusively with quills, hide, feathers, and other materials that they procured through the willing collaboration of animals and other beings. Making was and is a form of relating because it relied on these more than human kin networks. Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate citizen and scholar Kim Tallbear has defined the concept of an indigenous metaphysic as, quote, an understanding of the intimate knowing relatedness of all things, unquote. Within an indigenous metaphysic, matter is vibrant or lively because of the relationships that lace through it. When wool trade cloth, glass beads, mirrors, concha discs, the list goes on, arrived at the plains, on the plains, Lakota artists folded them into this creative system of kinship. As Lakota women used the same techniques to work with hide and cloth, beads and quills, these new materials became part of keeping the continuum of Lakota creativity alive. Within a framework of generosity, one of the most important parts of reading Lakota curatorial strategy and Experiments in Collaboration lies in recognizing that the exhibition was temporary. Because the exhibition was temporary, it facilitated rather than hindered the movement of belongings into and out of the museum without being caught in the collection's matrix. That is, all save for a few. The Sioux Indian Museum decided to buy 4 wall hangings from the show for their own collection, Door to the World and Whirlwind Design, as well as Early Spring, seen here on the right, and the untitled work here that hangs at center. Since 1973, these wall hangings have rarely been exhibited, largely kept in storage on racks and shelves full of other Lakota belongings that have had few visitors since they entered the collection. Like those other belongings, they cannot see the sky to observe the rising and setting sun or the changing of the seasons. But unlike many of the belongings held by the Sioux Indian Museum, the wall hangings were made to enter museum storage and hang on gallery walls. They both embody Lakota ways of knowing and stand in dialogue with a Western understanding of aesthetic appreciation. In this way, they can act as emissaries or visitors to the belongings that have been in the collection for generations longer. Although the wall hangings have not often left for exhibition elsewhere, when they do, they bring stories with them for those who are able to hear. Thank you.
So I just want to thank you both so much. What a wonderful way to end such a fruitful day. And as we enter into our last panel, one of the things that I love about this symposium and its structure is that because departments nominate students, we get such a broad swath of topics and methodologies, and that allows for great serendipitous moments, unexpected connections, and also, importantly, departures between seemingly unlike topics. And for me, hearing your two fantastic papers side by side, I couldn't help but be struck by some of the superficial formal similarities of the works that you showed. They were, both in both of the cases, they were working at almost the exact same time. The geometric abstract patterning of some of Amiotte's textiles and Hsiao's paintings, they might at first invoke ideas of flatness, but what was wonderful about hearing your papers together is how you break us out of that and open up the nuances and contradictions of the very different circulations. One of the things that I really appreciated in both of your papers was your really sharp attention to, in both cases, to how the works occupy space in ways that resist these flat readings, which I'm imagining some reception has sort of probably tried to put upon them. And that went sort of, and there were some sort of interesting resonances, whether it was the space of the gallery, the body, the hanging that you go into in the site of the giveaway. Also, the different systems of meaning that these objects occupied as they created and moved between display spaces. And in both cases, the ways that the artists and the objects moved between nations. And under these conditions of colonial and post-colonial conditions. And in your papers, something these very different sets of objects do have in common is that in both cases, they were at risk, or their makers saw them at risk of being overdetermined by their critical reception in a white American art market, particularly certain rhetorics of aesthetic modernism, of Western aesthetic modernism. And in both cases, the objects and the artists had to actively respond to what it meant to make and display art in those conditions. And I want to be very careful. I don't want to overextend this comparison because you are both so wonderfully precise in your own analysis. But I did think it was really interesting that you both were focused on how, again, in those conditions, the artists and the objects, and I want to be careful, and I might sort of ask you to sort of help me sort of navigate my language with that, but the artists and the objects, sought themselves to forge dialogues and relationships in those conditions. And so I have a question sort of for both of you coming from that. And so maybe I'll just, Filippo, because you spoke first, one of the things that I thought you did really beautifully, and which I'm grateful for because I know how hard it is you unpack for us what the paintings are saying, what Hsiao is saying about the paintings over time, what the titles of the paintings are saying, what various Chinese and American critics are saying, and you, with all their different and shifting cultural, political standpoints and viewpoints and agendas, and you do a really masterful job of explaining all those meanings, but allowing them to sit in contradiction with each other. I was really kind of grateful for the way that, and I thought that was like a really sort of model of not resolving all of those contradictory meanings that the work is creating, that, reception of the work is creating. Not forging a false resolution between them. And you particularly track Hsiao's movement over space as he navigates being a nomad. And thinking, and so this leads to my question, which is thinking about being a nomad as a spatial condition, made me wonder if you could speak more about change over time for him. And I'm specifically wondering about the changing times and social movements that he's entering into in New York City in 1967. This moment of, the Vietnam War, protest culture, a rising interest in meditation, or at least language around that. And so I guess I'd just be really curious to hear more about what was his New York, who was he hanging out with? What was his social, cultural, political milieu? And I'm thinking here about some of the language that he's using about, the American industrial complex. And it just made me curious about who he's talking to in the US and how that formed both, I'm holding on to this nuance you have of, both his paintings and then also his writing about his paintings.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this question. Absolutely. Well, it is very interesting, actually, because we do have a lot of information about his social circle in Italy in the 1960s, and pretty much the people he was friends with and the painters he was friends with, including Lucio Fontana, Piero Manzoni, the Italian neo-avant-garde. But when it comes to America, we know that he met with Mark Rothko, which is very interesting. Mark Rothko is, described by Hsiao as kind of a point of reference within, Western artists. He admits to feel a certain, kinship with his work. But the reason why I also wanted to study, the Hsiao's American period is that there is not much scholarly attention, and I think the artist himself kind of glosses over that period, because it was certainly a period of personal difficulties, and so he doesn't describe much of his social circle really. And I was lucky enough to find these letters that he sent to the gallerists while he was in America, and it was Rose Reed Gallery at first in New York City, and then Henry Gallery in Washington, D.C. After 1968. And it is interesting. It's like these negotiations between the artist and the galleries, and he's basically trying to organize a show in these spaces, but it is very hard to track his movements, and it is actually very interesting. In one of the documents at the Archives of American Art, in the folder of the Henry Gallery, there is a little note by the gallerist, and it says, "I don't know where the artist is." So it is hard to track, the people he was hanging out with, really. But yeah, I think it was also, he describes his American years as a period of solitude. So I think it was, really hard to navigate this world. Yes.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Julie, I would just ask the question, which I feel like I got sort of permission for a little bit, hearing about your exciting new position working at the PMA. So maybe with your kind of sort of new curatorial hat on, I would be curious. I mean, you do such an extraordinary job laying out how the objects navigate and speak to different audiences, and maybe just sort of picking up what you sort of laid down in your very conclusion about this idea of the works traveling and speaking and acting as emissaries in other spaces. I know you said that for the most part, I mean, that they were sort of doing that work sort of on location at the Sioux Indian Museum, but are there examples of them traveling? And I would be just curious if you have reflections on how they do that work as emissaries when they start to travel and enter into other spaces.
Thank you so much for that question. How do they do that work? So one of the things about these wall hangings that has been curious to me from the start is that I came to this project because I was curious about how Native artists either embraced or rejected the studio craft movement, and particularly in this case the fiber art movement as it was happening in the 60s and 70s, because of a long history of Native art being relegated to craft in museum collections and in scholarship. And in Amiotte, I found an example of someone who was intentionally using these fiber forms and languages, some of them the languages of minimalism. Other works are slightly more sculptural. He has works that were not in this exhibition that, although Door to the World has some webbing on it, that have stretched webbing, like knit yarn that acts as webbing. And so he was making these pieces intentionally to speak to, I mean, he was very savvy, he is very savvy. He knew that he wanted to reach a very specific audience, which was essentially a white museum-going audience. And he was doing that work through these pieces at the same time as he was learning more about how to do beadwork from his grandmother. And that's where these wall hangings come in, where many of them are interpretations of historic forms like robes, shirts, dresses that would be in the Sioux Indian Museum collection. And then, so the idea of the animacy of the objects, I take a lot of my thinking about visiting from Scots Lakota art, author and scholar Carmen Robertson, who had a recent book called Bead Talk that came out with a bunch of other collaborators, where she talks about visiting as a methodology. And in her words, the visiting as a methodology is coming out as something that we do as scholars. And so in other instances, I've thought about that as something that I myself am doing with Amiotte when I've gone for multi-day visits. But it struck me that these wall hangings and entering the collection, especially at the Sioux Indian Museum, we're doing a similar kind of visiting, where there were objects that had been held, or belongings that had been held in stasis. And I use the word belongings because that references the animacy that those belongings contain based on the context that they come out of. And so, one of the funny things about Amiotte and his work is that he totally, in most ways, rejected like a New York-centric art world. He had one wall hanging that was shown in an exhibition organized by Lloyd Oxendine in New York in 1970 that was very different from these and much more sort of drippy, woven, reminiscent of other fiber art that was going on at the time. But these works mostly have been displayed in South Dakota in regional retrospectives and largely have not left the region. And so that's something that I'm really thinking through in the broader dissertation, is sort of their mobility and the mobility of his textbooks and art curriculum and stuff like that.
Thank you. So with that, I would love to open it up also to the audience for questions.
No, it's okay. I had just a very particular question for Filippo, which is in thinking about this artist who in some sense is operating for those period of years in New York at the margins, and negotiating an axis that is between New York and DC, where DC is also somewhat at the margins of what has become a kind of epicenter, and doing work that's inflected as much by the Kenneth Nolan, those who are in DC, as it is by the Barnett Newmans and such who are in New York. And this is just a factual question, but it might, if you haven't looked into this, open up something in trying to find out his networks or his contacts, if he had any contact with the work or with the person, and Truett, for the way that she was, in some sense, painting in 3 dimensions with her sculptures that transformed something of the 2-dimensionality and flatness of New York School painting, Greenbergian modernism, into something that was at once pictorial and sculptural. And she was DC-based, and her husband had spent time in the East, and she had spent time in the East. So it would be kind of cool if, in fact, he had somehow either encountered her or her work. And so that's both a question but a prompt if you haven't looked into that, because she kept a diary. There's now the 4th of her so-called day books, and her work just might be something to think about in relation to his.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. So I don't know, and I don't have really an answer, but I did start thinking about this like 10 days ago. So I didn't really have time to delve much deep or at all, but it is an amazing prompt, so absolutely, thank you very much. And I should really try to find a way to investigate this kind of social network in America. Yes, But and thank you also for the suggestions about the margins, because like when he was in Italy, he described himself as at the margins of Europe, and then he wanted to come to America and describing New York as the center of art in the world. And so I think this tension between, the periphery and the center, as, a non-Western artist is, yeah, very, very interesting. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
It was actually designed, we're supposed to throw it. That's why it's like this, but we don't
At this point in the day, I've had a lot of coffee, but okay, great. Thank you to both speakers for wrapping up the third panel. And my question is for Giulia, and it really has to do with this methodology of relationality. And I'm wondering if you could speak to, if you've had a chance to think about this, or if you want to think about it on the fly, like how such a methodology can be applied in historical periods where the interlocutors are no longer living. Surely some aspect of that could pertain to the archive, but I'm thinking even in relation to people whose archives may not be accessible, robust, or present, and then certainly also thinking with the deep past about, how to enact such a methodology, which is deeply compelling when you can't visit with the person in lived experience, in real embodied space. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think that's one of the reasons that it's so generative to be here among so many different temporalities. But yeah, the methodologies that I've used around relationality and reciprocity come very much so out of the work of Indigenous studies scholars. I mentioned Kim Tallbear and Carmen Robertson, but and Sherry Farrell-Rosette in the talk, but there's an abundance of writing about that. And so in that specific instance, there is a protocol, which is that you talk with the extant communities to the extent that you can, extant communities to the extent that you can. And that's like deeply baked into kind of an ethical form of doing art history. But I think that, one of the things that there's much that the broader field of history and art history can learn from those strategies of sort of prioritizing relationship. And so I framed this project as a dialogue with a single artist because I wanted to invest in this methodology. But I don't have examples from the deep past, and I would be fascinated to hear from folks who maybe are thinking with those materials. But for instance, my master's paper was on the WPA slave narrative photographs that are in the Library of Congress. The narratives themselves were collected mostly by white Southerners and Northerners who were hired by the WPA. And they've been a deep resource for historians of the experience of enslavement. But there was a set of photographs that came along with them that were not reproduced in the microfilm. And so most scholars have not associated the text and the photographs together. They're also not digitized together. And so that was an instance where I was thinking with historical material. And in that instance, the idea that I came up with was sort of I never got to do this because it was a COVID-era project, but tracing the lineages of those people in those photographs and trying to get in touch with descendant communities. And in fact, a journalist in The Atlantic did that very same thing a week after I submitted my master's paper. So that work has been done, fortunately. But yeah, I think it's a question that has to come in when we frame our projects. And I know that a lot of the work that I've done would not have been possible if that hadn't been something I had been prompted to think about by both my coursework and the reading identity exams and generous conversations with colleagues.
Thank you so much. Filippo, I love, just as Ali said, how you are so careful to in a really interesting dialogue, there's a reciprocity on your side of valuing so deeply the artist's agency over their creation and the artist's words and the art and the community from which it was born. And then also a sort of skepticism on your part, Filippo, of, you know, there's the artist's words, and then there's the object, and then there's the reception, and you know, just, anyways, that was just a design. My question was about how you spoke so much about American modernism and kind of a Greenbergian narrative around American modernism. And I was wondering if Chen engages in his writings or how you read his paintings in dialogue more with European models of abstraction that are, I mean, I'm thinking very specifically of Mondrian because, and I love, this is a fantastic example where Mondrian essentially turns the canvas into relief, right? Like that the objecthood of the canvas is essential to the project, and also essentially to the project of using abstraction in this kind of spiritualist realm, right? Of opening up, moving away from what is, and this kind of portal to what is unseen, right? So I'm just curious if that seems like a much closer dialogue to me, and if he's spoken about that, if that's kind of a point of reference for you in your thinking.
Thank you very much for this question. It is very interesting because many Taiwanese commentators, in commenting the works of the Taiwanese diasporic artists in Italy, and it's Hsiao and two other artists, Huogan and Li Yuanjia. They both, all three of them go to Italy in the 1960s. And Hsiao and Huogan, they spent pretty much 40 to 50 years in Italy. And I think the most intense dialogue is with the Italian currents of geometric abstraction. It started in the 1950s, and then it continued in the 1960s and the 1970s. And of course, these trends of geometric abstraction refer to European historical models, but they wanted to place themselves on the cusp between what was perceived as an overly rationalizing and cold abstraction of Northern European models, which is, we could argue a formalist reading of these models, and what was happening with informal art in Europe and American abstract expressionism. And so I think the dialogue, which is a little unexplored, but it's starting to be studied, is between these three artists and what was happening in Italy really in the 1960s. And Hsiao and Huogan, they both talk of their, really in this case quite extensively, about their social network with Italian geometric abstract painters, and then with Lucio Fontana, which was pretty much the most important artist in the city of Milan, where they lived between the 1950s and the 1960s. And Fontana is another artist who Hsiao talks about a lot. And it's these two artists, really, Rothko and Fontana. Mm-hmm. And I think it is interesting to kind of reflect about this idea of spaces or space, really, or of the reflection of the on the pictorial space by Rothko and Fontana, and why Hsiao says that he feels it's particularly close to his own poetics. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. I want to share my thanks for what has been a long and fruitful day. Thank you to the University of Pennsylvania for being this year's organizer, and of course to Bryn Mawr and to Temple as co-organizers. Thank you to the professors and students who came from universities some sort of far away and for traveling on what ended up being a very chilly Philadelphia days. Thank you very much to Christiane for her wonderful talk last night and for modeling for us a mode of rigorous scholarly engagement in the world and exchange in a moment when we really need it. And like everyone, I'm deeply thankful to Aaliyah for her meticulous organization of the day, which allows everyone's ideas to shine, for the discussion to thrive, but that depends on organization, so I'm very grateful for it. And I want to give my special thanks to the graduate students for their vibrant talks and for making me feel really good about what I do, so thank you for that. And so thank you all, and safe travels home.